Welcome everyone. I'm really excited to be moderating today the panel of London International Shipping Week and having with me these industry leaders and experts. So we have with us today Claire Wright, who is the Managing Director of Hanwha Ocean in Europe. We have Dacy, CIO, Global Head of Transportation, JP Morgan Asset Management. Silke Lehmköster, Managing Director, Fleet of Hapag-Lloyd. And Mirtcho Spassov, Manager of Decarbonisation of Eastern Pacific Shipping. Now, we meet at a critical moment for shipping. The IMO Net Zero Framework, which has already been named several times today, and I'm sure we will keep mentioning them during this week and the next weeks to come. It was approved in April, as we have heard, as we know. It's up for adoption. We have heard very positive signals and thoughts that it will go forward in October. And if it does, it will really shape the future of the maritime decarbonization. But still, there are fuel supply issues, cost issues, technology issues, regulation issues that are really pressing the industry. Again, our panel really brings a lot of expertise, and today we're going to try to address the readiness of the industry, regulations, the technology, and possible path forward. So let's begin with the headline issue, again, the IMO Net Zero Framework. I was going to say in my notes, if it gets approved, I feel that now I need to be a bit more positive when it gets approved. Anyhow, I would like to hear your views on whether is the industry ready for this and how are your organizations handling? Maybe Mirtcho, you can start?
Sure. It seems that it's going to be a challenge, obviously. The industry is continuing to build expertise in the space, but there's still a lot of fleets that operate purely conventional fuels are only now starting to make the first foray into alternative fuels, including LNG. Just on our side, we've been fortunate to have focused for most of the last decade on reducing our emissions and decarbonizing. And we have now gone through our first dry dock cycle with our first dual-fuel LNG container vessels. They've been in our fleet for 5-6 years already. We've completed 450 bunker operations, and a small but increasing number of those have been incorporating bio-LNG.
Okay.
And so we've been learning a lot in the process, but there's still a long way to go. And of course, we're not stopping here. The industry needs to move and adopt other fuels as well in the future. And we're working very closely with our technology partners and most importantly, our seafarers on launching our first ammonia dual-fuel vessels in a couple of years.
Very good. And how are they feeling, the seafarers, about that?
They obviously, some of them have concerns. Yeah. Some of them are eager to be part of the new technology. And so it's very important to have them very early on in the dialogue. We've been carrying ammonia as a cargo on our vessels for more than 10 years. So that gives us a bit of a head start in terms of understanding some of those safety concerns more than others. But it definitely will require a lot of effort and proper training to ensure it's done as safe as possible.
Perfect. We will be following up. Thank you. Silke, from your side.
Yes, I think decarbonization is nothing new to the industry. We have all read the assignments. I think most of us also accepted the challenge by now. It is a challenge, but we need to go forward on it. As you rightfully said, we have also trained the seafarers, at least for LNG preparation or operations on board. We will take further steps for other technologies that we implement on board. Same we did with the shoreside personnel, because I think it is vital that shore and sea always know how to speak to each other and on what terms also about what. When I then look, yes, we have invested, or we started investing in our fleet, in our assets. We have also implemented the regulations around the CII, EU ETS, so we know by now how to work with legal frameworks on emissions and so on. So bottom line, I would say now comes the reality check with the adoption of the IMO framework. Was all of our preparation enough? And where do we have the gaps to fill in the future?
Thank you. Thank you so much. Andy, what about yourself?
Yeah, I think, look, we're very early stage in this process, and is it a lofty goal, the net zero framework? Absolutely. We should definitely be leaning in that direction. But I always feel that, in my opinion at least, there's going to be a disconnect between what we're hoping to achieve and what we can actually achieve in short amounts of time. And 2030, those of you who are getting older, like I've experienced, comes very quickly. 5 years isn't like what it used to be. We're going to be there very quickly. And the complexity of a lot of this is very high. And the costs are extremely high. And I use one example, which is 1 extra million tons of ammonia production. It used to be about 4 or 5 years ago, about $1 billion of FID. That's probably about a 1 to 1.5 billion today. So 180 million tons of ammonia produced each year. Just to take that 10 to 15 billion that's going to be produced by the Net Zero Framework Fund, you're not really making that big of a dent. And that's traditional ammonia production. That's not using sort of renewable energy to produce ammonia production. And I sometimes feel like there's more constituents that have to be part of this discussion. Sure, the ship owners are very important, and we're sort of the nexus to a certain extent, but the fuel producers, and they never really seem to be in these conferences, and they frankly should be. The end users ultimately are going to be footing the cost. And just the infrastructure, right? We're not even talking about the infrastructure costs. So I think, and not to say that we don't appreciate the enormity of these issues, but they're there. And I often feel that sometimes we sort of wave it off a little bit, and we have charts that say, oh, we'll produce this fuel and it'll be available here, and so on and so forth. And not to say that, for example, I love this carbon capture corridor concept, and more innovative, sort of very detailed, specific things like that are what we need, and we can't lose sight, of course, of all the sort of small things that we're doing to lower emissions. But the big ones, the ammonia, the hydrogen, those are, I think, probably going to take a little longer than we expect them to. And that's been what I wrestle with on a daily basis. And I said at the beginning, we absolutely should lean into this heavily, but we should be extremely realistic about what it is that we're undertaking.
Thank you. So we are ready, or we are not ready?
As was just said, we're at the beginning of potentially maybe thinking about being ready. So.
Okay. It's a first step. It's a first step. Thank you. Yeah. Claire, what are your thoughts on this?
I think it is a question of who are we asking to be ready. If I speak from a technology developer point of view, the technologies already exist for different propulsions. I think the challenge for owners today is they're having to make a choice of which propulsion they use. Even dual fuel is a choice of which technology, which fuel will mature in the trades that owner is working on. So the technologies are there for onboard carbon capture and storage, energy efficiency for different fuel propulsions, fuel cells, batteries for different applications. I think the challenge from a developer point of view is we are developing multiple pathways simultaneously, and that comes at a cost without knowing which ones will actually mature in terms of commercial deployment from a ship owner perspective in terms of wanting to buy those. And that makes it tough for us to essentially decide how we allocate our engineering resource. But I think the barrier or the factor that will influence that is not necessarily the availability of the technology. It is the availability of the fuels where that particular owner needs them. We've already seen that those that have moved further ahead are those with a closer link to the end consumer, where they are making readiness and dual fuel choices and sourcing fuels. But obviously there are other sectors that bunker in a wide variety of places where those decisions are harder to make.
Thank you. I'm going to stay with you. And again, I was going to say in my notes, if it gets adopted, based on the previous conversations, when it gets adopted, might I say, in a more positive, there's still a lot of work to be done, right, in terms of shaping the guidelines. What parts of the regulations do you feel that need particular focus?
I think from our point of view, obviously, the IMO is fuel and technology neutral, as it should be, so we're developing different pathways. I think probably the big one from our point of view, Arsenio Dominguez mentioned it himself, it's the life cycle analysis, so that we can understand the pathways for each fuel and the timings at which fuels will be both available and required by ships and and when they may have endpoints. The other one for us in terms of developing a range of new technologies from gas turbine engines that can use ammonia followed by hydrogen, potentially fuel cells, batteries, is how will that GFI fund be deployed to essentially enable the development of new technologies and the acceleration of their deployments. That probably is from a technology developer point of view, the one that is uncertain. I think the other point which is very linked to that is, obviously that's talking about new builds. There is still a very large fleet of existing vessels. Will that fund be available to enable us to look at, well, how do we really cost effectively improve the performance of those ships so that we're not, as an industry, being asked to prematurely scrap ships before the end of their commercial life?
Thank you. Andy, any thoughts?
I mean, if we're prematurely scrapping ships, I'm not sure where we're going to be able to build additional ships to replace the ships that we're prematurely scrapping. And I'm just sort of coming off of the point you made there, but as we all know, there were serious issues in terms of labor capacity in places like Korea, South Korea, as well as Japan, and then certainly more issues around China as a viable source of shipping. And I think it will continue to be a source of shipbuilding, but obviously geopolitics is impacting that. But and maybe that's a good point to mention, is that there is a broader world. Knut talked about the impact of geopolitics with the Red Sea and, of course, what's happening in Ukraine. And I think that if nothing else, the last 5 years has shown us that humans have a hard time getting along with each other. And that's been, frankly, good for shipping. So the pressure on supply will probably continue to be the case, at least now, especially in a world where maybe some large country that historically provided a bit of a policeman type of role globally is not doing that as much anymore, or is sporadic in how it does it. And so a more multipolar world probably leads to more geopolitical risk and more tension and probably more pressure on shipping supply, which oddly is good for the industry because it provides probably higher charter rates. But against this backdrop, we're also trying to implement this very noble cause that we're all talking about here. And I wonder to what extent these geopolitical risks. Hello, testing. I'll just speak loud. There we go. These geopolitical risks are going to put pressures that we're not anticipating on the net zero transition. And again, I'm just getting back to my earlier point, which is I fear that the very jovial conversation between Knut and Arsenio a few minutes ago, you roll ahead to 2030 and replace Knut with the shipping industry and with Arsenio with the broader sort of regulatory framework. And, we just need to make sure that we're working in lockstep through this next 5 years, because I think there are big challenges that we're perhaps just underestimating, as I mentioned. So maybe that's my theme for today.
Thank you. Mirtcho, your views?
Yeah, just to echo some of the opinions that have been expressed, obviously completing the life cycle assessment for key fuels like LNG with a very scientific, rigorous approach, taking the emotions out of it to make sure we have an adequate baseline is one important aspect. Second is the chain of custody and certification models for the various fuels, including biofuels and synthetic fuels. Yes. That will be very important as to the efficiency with which you can manage these bunkering operations on a global basis. And finally, the use of proceeds, of course, from the funds that are being collected.
Yes.
A robust mechanism would give a lot more confidence and staying power for the mechanism.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Now we have heard from Eric, also Knut has mentioned it, that the fleet that is able to consume low greenhouse gas fuel is growing, but still we are lagging behind in terms of infrastructure and that green fuel supply. So Silke, maybe you can share with us what's the biggest challenges that Hapag-Lloyd is facing in that respect, and how are you bridging that gap to close it?
Yeah, we have a certain network that we are operating in, and of course with our fleet or with our vessels we would like to have the maximum of flexibility into it. So we don't want to be bound to, for example, one specific port where we could bunker, let it be green methanol or ammonia in the future, or even LNG, where we also started off with one port worldwide where we could fuel our first LNG vessel. But we need more flexibility, otherwise this does not work for our customers, but also for our colleagues in the network planning. So aside of the availability that we need for fuel, we also need the flexibility, and all of that together shall come at a price where it actually makes sense to buy this kind of fuel. Because by the end of the day, we also have customers who must be willing to pay on this one. And on the other hand, we also need the certainty in planning. How much will the fuel cost us, and how much also might it be if we need to divert on the route for it. So bottom line, we say we need to stay fuel agnostic. We will not put all bets on one single card. We have conventional fuel with biofuels in the fleet for the moment. We are looking into LNG/biomethane. We are retrofitting to methanol next year. We have even started looking into ammonia vessels very cautiously.
Okay.
But we don't want to leave out any type of fuel for the future. Also not carbon capture. We have looked into that wind-assisted propulsion on container vessels.
Yeah.
Also did a deep dive on that one. So it is key to stay broad-minded. And then the second key for success is that as a ship owner, you get direct access to the fuel. And that is also why we decided to invest directly into the fuel supply chain and made a deal with Goldwyn on green methanol.
Okay, yeah.
That will be supplied, of course, not today, but in the future when we also think that we are ready with our vessels on the other side. But if you do not have this direct access to green fuel in the future, you don't have the availability, you don't have a certainty on the price, and that's why we believe it is really vital to also move away from a pure focus on shipping and the fleet, but also on fuel accessibility.
Thank you. Claire, what about from your side?
Yes, I think our biggest challenge is around, Silke very kindly mentioned a whole range of technologies. Obviously, as a technology developer, shipyard, retrofitter, we have to develop those technologies. And we work in a variety of different segments in shipping, all of which are choosing different solutions. And the sequencing of those solutions obviously is very different across different fleets. Those that are closer to the end consumer generally are moving further ahead. But then there are those that are still focused on energy efficiency and conventional fuel, which is right for them at this particular point. So from our point of view, the challenges are really around what to develop and when, and how will we commercialize what we are developing. And certainly in October, I hope that will give us more certainty on the timelines, because for a ship owner, the constraint is around crew training and crew development. For us, it's around engineering resource and being able to deploy that engineering resource where it meets the customer's needs at the moment. But when we're dealing with ship owners ranging from small ferry operators in Europe looking at batteries and fuel cells to large container ship operators looking at energy efficient technologies, plus, say, methanol or ammonia dual fuel, that's quite a range of engineering that we need to deploy for our customers. So having some certainty around which ones will mature and when. And also, I think that does link into, as Andy said, around the fuel, what fuels will be available for the industry, and that will help us channel the work that we're doing.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing, Claire. Andy, as a ship owner with a large fleet, there are opportunities and challenges with any transition. What are those for you and your organization?
We've talked about a lot of them, but I was just going to echo what's been said. I think there is low-hanging fruit. I know for us, for example, we've invested in dual-fuel methanol vessels, and certainly we could debate sort of the viability of that longer term. And I think just to take that as an example, one of the biggest challenges is getting qualifying carbon to inject into the production process, and there's not a lot of qualifying carbon available these days to actually be part of a green methanol production supply chain. So yet again, sort of a component that's outside of the actual production process. But we're working in our case together with large end users, oil majors or energy majors that have made their own commitments to producing the green methanol. So I think that's an example of partnerships that are important with end users that are willing to spend the time and the money and the resources to develop that. LNG, as was talked about, we've done dual-fueled LNG carriers of different, sort of small chemical tankers, for example, and one of the challenges there, for example, when you did have a big geopolitical disruption like the invasion of Russia into Ukraine, LNG, as you all remember, spiked quite dramatically, and we didn't burn a molecule of LNG, I think, for about a year and a half because it was so expensive, which brings the whole cost factor into the equation. And I think cost is broad-based. I think generally speaking, setting even this entire decarbonization trajectory to the side, if we weren't even doing this, I think costs are on their way up. We've seen persistent high ship new building prices. I don't think that's going away anytime soon. I don't think yards are proliferating anywhere near like they did if you go back 20 or 30 years ago. And those of us that have been in the industry, used to always be, the quote was, yard capacity was infinite, and that was the sort of ultimate Achilles heel of the industry, because when rates were high, everybody went and built 1,000 ships and then destroyed the market the next year. But that can't happen anymore for all the reasons that we're familiar with. So I think ship prices will be persistently high. I think crew also is going to be a big issue going forward. OpEx is not going down anytime soon. Not only are there the training requirements that we've talked about, but there's just the accessibility to crew. And I'm sure as all of us who are ship owners are experiencing, getting qualified crew from some of the traditional sources is not as easy as it used to be. And we just made a big investment in a large ship manager, OSM Tome, and one of the biggest drivers of that was accessing the big crewing operation that they have in Manila in the Philippines. But my point, I think, is that crew are now, asking rightfully for better conditions and for higher wages, and that's going to be going on. And then you add the additional training into that, that'll increase the costs even more. So I do think we're on this trajectory of high costs for all the reasons we're talking about, and that's something we have to incorporate into our thought process. So these are the types of things that we think about, especially with a large fleet like we have. And all of that is going to have to get reflected ultimately in charter rates at some point in the future. And on top of that, you have this fleet now, and hopefully I'll finish my point here in a moment, but that is comprised not just of the higher priced ships that have been built since 2020, but also of ships that were built in a previous era, pre-pandemic, that were arguably priced at lower prices, which still reflect the majority of the vessels out there. So we're having to build new higher cost ships against a market that's pricing off an average fleet price that is reflective of roughly 80% of the world fleet that's been built at a lower cost basis. So I think that's where you're seeing this big disconnect between charter rates and ship prices, and it'll take some time, in my opinion, for the percentage of the fleet to reflect these higher cost, decarbonizing oriented vessels that we're all trying to focus on today. So that gap, just from a pure economic perspective, is something that I struggle with in terms of how do you spend the money on all these different things that are so important when the charter rate market is still pricing off ships that were built in 2015.
Thank you. Thank you, Andy. The report that we have presented today demonstrates how solutions like wind-assisted propulsion, onboard carbon capture and storage really contribute, into the maritime decarbonization journey. Mirtcho, how is EPS taking into account these solutions in your decarbonization strategy, and how are you looking at the business case for them?
Sure, I'll pick up on wind first. We see wind as very much complementary to the alternative fuels. It's a source of energy on board, and we think it's applicable both for conventionally fueled vessels, but also for alternatively fueled vessels. If you consider a ship with wind-assisted propulsion on, say, not particularly attractive route, you might get a payback period of almost 10 years, just simply based on fuel savings alone. But if you take into account the same ship sailing on alternative fuels, that may be 2 or 3 times more expensive. The payback period shortens dramatically. Similarly, if you take into account the full cost of regulation that might add carbon taxes, whether it's EU ETS, Fuel EU, or preferential treatment under the IMO Net Zero framework, you have to take all of these into account when you do the business case and really look at, on a life cycle basis, how do you ensure the lowest possible abatement cost and economic operation of your vessel. Maybe on the carbon capture side to add, it's heartening to see that we're moving beyond the period where we're very focused on can we make it technologically work on board, to can we make a fully self-sustaining supply chain that can take the CO2, deliver it, reuse it or sequester it, and focus on the business case. So the industry has moved beyond proving the technological capability on board and into proving the business case, which is the next challenge and something very important.
Perfect. But you're gonna keep trying them.
We need to keep trying.
Yes, yeah. I look forward to seeing how that goes. We need to start wrapping up, but I would like to close up with a question and hearing thoughts from every one of you, maybe starting with you, Claire. Going back to the current geopolitical situation, right, and times of uncertainty. So how do you see the new building orders and the retrofits playing out in the future?
So when?
How do you see that evolving and the trend?
I was going to say, when the vote happens.
Okay, yes. Okay, yes, when.
That's what I say.
Now we say when.
Not assuming.
No.
From a new build perspective, since April, actually, we've seen a bit of a split. So we've seen in the close to consumer markets like containers, they're still continuing with the energy efficiency, the dual fuel. On the tanker side, we've actually seen a step back to conventional and a focus on energy efficiency because of the uncertainty around what the pathways will be and what the regulation will be, as well as the support of the full value chain, both from a chartering perspective and also from the fuel supply perspective. So one thing I hope from the regulation coming in is it will give us the certainty on what will be required when, that will then enable those business cases that Mirtcho talked about to be clear in terms of what will be feasible and when, and that would be a really positive step forward for us as an industry. Just a quick note on onboard carbon capture and storage. Technically, it's feasible. It's around how do you, in a low carbon and low economic cost way, have an infrastructure that is enabled to capture that. If we start to see, and this is probably my final point, if we start to see the demand for fuels in other industrial sectors and the demand for carbon capture and storage in other industrial sectors, that creates the infrastructure that as an industry we can then piggyback on, and that will make it more cost effective than anything we have to develop on our own.
Thank you. Andy, from your side, quickly?
The question's, is this going to work or not? Or
No, how do you see the new buildings,
the
trends with the current...
Yeah, I would echo what Claire said in the sense that certainly clarity will be provided with the approval or the vote or however we're referring to it. But like I've been saying, I think there's going to be moments of 2 steps forward and 1 step back. I think the story is far from over here. And there's going to be unintended things, the unknown unknowns that we're not really familiar with yet in terms of how the implementation of these different fuel technologies will be adopted. There's going to be a whole series of regional reactions, particularly in ports, to different types of ships when they're ultimately built. I think ammonia still has a long way to go to get sort of adopted from a safety perspective, even though new engine technology seems to be working in the right direction. But we at least internally have had issues with the crew not being too keen to work on an ammonia-powered vessel for obvious reasons. And then, we haven't even talked about the energy density issues, which are going to potentially require a whole swathe of the industry's fleet to be rebuilt with different levels of fuel tanks or sizes of fuel tanks. So there's a lot of details yet to come. But should we be doing it? As I said, yes, but let's buckle down because this is going to be a stormy journey.
Thank you. Silke?
I think decarbonization is not an option or something it's nice to have. So coming from my company and also purely looking at container vessels, I do see a lot of efforts still going on. We have seen it first in the bigger size segment, a lot of dual fuel engines and orders on that one. Now we also transition in investing into smaller vessels, and also there we see a lot of orders actually with dual fuel engines. So I think there's a lot of commitment, and also we haven't stopped my company in particular, but also in the industry on large container vessels in investing in retrofits. It's still going on. We haven't stopped. And I think what we need to keep in mind that aside of the IMO framework, we still have Fuel EU Maritime coming up. We have EU ETS, we have the CII, we have so many other regulations. And if we don't take the chance now of having one global pricing system, we are really losing out on an option, because I'm afraid that otherwise we will have a lot of fragmented systems. Every country or larger countries together will roll out something else. And this will make it only more complicated for us as an industry.
Thank you. Thank you. Mirtcho?
A lot of it has been said, but just to echo, it's a lot easier to decarbonize the larger ships.
Yep.
As you move towards smaller sizes, the capital cost relative to the cost of the vessel, the amount of cargo space you might need to sacrifice becomes a lot more pronounced. So we see a trend where fleets will focus on first decarbonizing the larger vessels and try to spread out some of those environmental benefits through formal or informal pooling or aggregation of the fleets as the most cost-efficient manner to achieve the first step of decarbonizing those fleets.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much for sharing your insights. Thank you so much for the audience for listening in. Conversations like the ones we have had today help us to test assumptions, share solutions, and hopefully move the industry forward. Back to you, Anna. Thank you.